Hello everybody, and welcome back. This is our second video in the Bushcraft series. It's kind of a cool rainy morning out here in mid-Missouri, so we're just out in the backyard under the tarp. Speaking of which, when you're first getting started out, learning new skills and practicing new skills, I know not everybody's as lucky as me and you got 4 acres of woods out back, but you should be able to just go out in the backyard and work on these things before you head out on a day trip or even an overnighter to get a little more involved. So with that said, today we're going to get into some knots, hitches, and lashings. Working with cordage basically. Alright, you can't really set up a quickie shelter like the tarp or even get more involved with natural materials and whatnot unless you know some basic knots and lashings. The old saying is, if you can't tie it right, tie it a lot. That's fine and that's true. If you don't lash it properly, then you need to lash it a lot to make sure that things don't fall down. But I mean, we're heading out into the wilderness with a limited amount of cordage. We just can't be wrapping the hell out of things just to make sure it doesn't fall down. If we know how to tie it right, we limit the amount of cordage we actually need to use to do things, saving it for other projects. So to get started with, we'll learn some basic knots. All right. So there's a difference between a knot and a hitch. A knot is basically tying two ends of a piece of cordage together, okay, whether that's tying two ends of the same cordage or tying two separate pieces together. All right, that's basically a knot. A hitch is where you're going to tie one object to another object using the cordage. All right, and so you'll see the difference as we go along. So the first basic knot we're going to talk about is very common. Most of you have probably seen it, and it's the square knot. And again, that's either taking two pieces of the same size cordage and tying the ends together, or for a lot of purposes it's two ends of the same cord. And it's very easy not to tie, and all it is, and I'll be using my hands, it's just you can go right over left like you're going to tie an overhand knot, and then you're going to go left over right and then pull it down, and basically what you have then are two interlocking loops. Alright, now you'll notice with the paracord, as you crank it down, it wants to slip a little bit, but it will get to the point where it locks in and it won't go any further. Now this is very important. You'll notice it comes right apart. When you crank it down and everything's locked in place, it stays there, but when I want to get it apart, it slides right, it falls right apart. Alright, and it's very important, especially when you get into some of the first aid stuff. Say I'm making a sling, or I'm tying a bandage or tying a tourniquet. At some point you're going to need to take that knot out, and the square knot is the knot you're going to want to use because it'll pull right out. Alright, so that's the square knot. Now I know my 550 cord here is the same diameter, but let's say the coyote color here is a smaller rope. Okay, so we want to take two pieces of rope of different sizes and tie them together for whatever reason. And the knot we're going to use for that is called a sheet bend. Alright, it's very similar to a square knot, but it's got one little difference. So we're going to start off with our larger rope, the red cord, and make a bite or a loop in the end of it. Alright, just an open loop. Come from the underneath side with your smaller cord, go around underneath the knot, or underneath the bite of the larger cord. Now here's the difference of the square knot. A square knot, I would just go back through it and you'd have a square knot. But with the sheet bend, we're actually going to go back underneath the smaller cord itself and cross over the front like that. Alright, and when we pull that down, the smaller cord then is actually going to lock in on itself, and that'll keep it from slipping. When you have cordage of two different sizes, the square knot's going to want to slip out pretty bad. So you're going to use the sheet bend. Just like that. All right. Now sometimes you're going to want a loop, and the loop, you might want something that slips and you might want something that doesn't. All right. So for a slip loop, you could use a simple square knot if you want. One I found that's a little more robust, won't come undone in the middle of doing something like a slip knot will. They call a stevedore's knot, or a packer's knot. I'm sorry, stevedore is something else. This is the packer's knot, and really all you're going to do is do a figure 8 in the end of your rope and keep it fairly loose. Just leave the figure 8 open. Take the other end of your rope and bring it through the loop on the figure 8. Then you can tighten things down. All right. And what you end up with is a knot that'll crank down. And that's why they call it the packer's knot. All right. This is not that you would use to say bail up newspaper or something like that. It's what they bail up packages with. All right. So that's the packer's knot. So that'll be a noose that slips. Now there's going to be times when you want a loop that maintains its shape, so to speak, either in a rescue or just helping somebody up an incline. You want to put a loop in the rope that they can put around them, but it won't cinch down on them and either further an injury or even create one. Other uses for it, it's what I have out on the corners of the tarp. That's what I tie my cordage to the loops on the corner of my tarp with. And that's called a bowline. All right. So this is another one of those. It's real simple to tie, but it's also real easy to mess up. So what we're going to do is, this is the end we're going to make the loop with, the short end of the rope. All right. So all we're going to do is kind of give it a little twist and put make a loop with the short end over our long end or standing end. All right. So we have our loop. Now we're going to do, this is the rabbit comes out of the hole, runs around the tree and sees the fox and dives back in the hole again. Okay. We're going to come out of the loop, go around the standing end, and come back down through the loop again. Alright, so basically we have a loop on loop locking down on each other. Alright, and now you have a loop that won't slip. It'll maintain its size. Alright, now I have heard with larger rope guys using this as an anchor loop for, say, a rappel rope, and the bowline has come undone. With a larger rope, it's easier for it before you get, all the weight on it to come undone. So if you're going to use it in that application, what I would suggest is that you leave enough running end of your knot, the end from creating the loop and tying the knot, that you, I know we haven't got to the hitches yet, but that you do a half hitch with it. Alright, and wrap it around the side of the loop that it's sticking out on, if that makes sense. Alright, and what that'll do is lock down that tag end, if you will, and keep the bowline itself from coming undone. Now, speaking of the anchor point, the reason people like using the bowline for the anchor point is like the square knot. Once it's got weight on it and it gets tensioned, once you're done with it and you want to take it down, it's fairly easy not to untie, because again, it's crossed loops and you basically just pull the loops apart and it comes undone. I would suggest, if you're going to do an anchor point, that you do what they call a figure 8 retrace. Alright, now to just make a simple loop in the end of the line without anchoring it to something, we're going to tie the figure 8 knot with a bite or with a loop in it. Alright, simple enough. But we need to get an anchor point on this, right? So what they do, you just see me do it. So we tie a figure 8 in our rope, and all we're going to do is go around our anchor point, and we're going to follow. That's why they call it a retrace. We're going to follow the other loop around. So we come through, we come around, come underneath, come around again, and we come back out the other end of the figure eight, and then we crank her down. Now the reason people don't like doing that is because once this does get cranked down, it's hard to get undone again. That's why they use the bowline. So if you're going to use it for an anchor point, for say rappelling, where somebody's life's hanging on the end of the line, use the figure eight, or use the half hitch to lock in the bowline, one or the other. Alright, so that basically covers our knots, the everyday stuff that you're going to need out there. Alright, now we want to talk about hitches. And again, hitches are what we're going to use to secure one object to another, be it our tarp to a stake, or two poles together, or in the case of one of the hitches, it's what we use the majority of the time to start our lashing. Alright, so the first hitch we'll talk about is the simple half hitch. Okay, so let's say we got a post and we got this long end, or this is our stake, we got this long end tied to our tarp. The half hitch is basically an overhand knot that's pulled to the side. Okay, that's one half hitch. When you come out of the loop right there, go back over the standing end and do it again over itself, and that's two half hitches. Alright, and this can slide up and down. You crank it down against the stake, or you can pull it back out to shorten up this line. Alright, so that's two half hitches. A better one to use, though, because the two half hitches do slide fairly easily, is what they call the top line hitch. Alright, so we're going to start out, and we're actually going to leave the loop fairly large. Alright, let's say this is our stake. You're going to start out with the single half hitch. You're going to go ahead and loop it around itself one more time. Come back through like that. Then you're going to come out of the loop and go over the standing end of your rope that's running out to your tarp, and come back through that, basically making a half hitch then on the outside. This is easier to do under tension, obviously, but just so you see what that looks like, that is the top line hitch. And again, you can move it up and down to adjust the tension, but with the extra hitch on there, with tension on it, once you put it where you want it to be, it'll pretty much lock in place and it'll stay there. Alright, but it still allows you to adjust things, tighten it up or loosen it as needed. So that's the top line hitch. Another hitch we're going to use from time to time, one of the lashings will call for it, and you can also use it for dragging large items across the ground. Let's say we have this large log that we need to drag back to camp for firewood. We're going to use what they call a timber hitch. Alright, all you're going to do is go around the log, take your short end over the long end, and then you're just going to wrap it around itself 3 or 4 times and then crank it down. Alright, that's the timber hitch. Now if I was dragging a large log, what I would do is tie this on the far end and then come up to the other end of the log and basically do like a half hitch around it, and then I would be able to drag my log. Alright, and it'll keep when you do it like this, it helps you maintain control of the log. Alright, instead of just having it tied on the end. So that's the timber hitch. Alright, the other hitch that we're going to use in lashing, among other things, is called the clove hitch. Alright, so what we're going to do with the clove hitch, go around your pole, go over the top. You're going to go around again, going over the top of the other one, and then as you come back through, you're going to go underneath it. So what you're going to have something that looks like that. Alright, and then we would begin our lashing. So that's the clove hitch. Alright, so we've got a couple basic knots covered, got a couple basic hitches covered. So now we're going to get into some actual lashing. Alright, so for the first lashing we'll talk about, probably the most common thing you'll want to do around camp is make you a tripod to hang your cook pot over the fire, or for any other reasons. You might want to use a tripod as the base for a natural shelter or whatever. At any rate, what we're going to do is, like I talked about before, I really like the bank line for lashings. Other things, you can use paracord for short-term stuff. Just remember that the paracord will work loose after a while. Another thing you can use is just get a ball of twine, like baling twine or something like that. But I would recommend that you not get the plastic stuff, get the natural fiber like jute twine. Anyway, so our first lashing we'll talk about is tripod lashing. And what we're going to start off with our bank line is, on one side we're going to start off with a clove hitch. Alright, so get our clove hitch made. Now, we're on the top side of that one. What you're going to do the tripod is almost like a weave or a figure eight. Alright, I'm going to go under the next one, over the next one, come around it then. So now that's under and that one's over. Now when I'm doing this, I typically like to get the tag end or the loose end for my original clove hitch, and I'll just bend that over and I'll get that captured in the lashing. So I just continue with the figure eight, keeping everything lined up. You don't have to do this very tight initially, and I'll show you why here in a second. We do want to keep the loops down next to each other, but we don't have to crank these poles up tight yet, because we're going to do that in just a second. Let me get one more wrapping. Now, to do this properly, I would probably go a good 5 to 7 loops around everything here. But just for demonstration purposes, we're going to call that good, at least for the figure eight part. Now what we're going to do to tighten things up a little bit now is go in between two of them there, and you want to get a couple of what they call frappings. Instead of wrappings, these are frappings. Alright, you want to do that at least twice, and then come under one, and then do it again in between the other two. And again, you want to do it at least twice. Alright, you don't have to, I wouldn't go more than 3 times depending on how big the logs are. But then once you get a couple of wraps there, then we're going to finish off on one of them, and I'll just use the outside one here. Finish off with another clove hitch. Alright. Alright, so there we go. And again, start off with a clove hitch, figure eight, 5 to 7 times, a couple of frappings in between, go over to the next one, couple of frappings in with a clove hitch, and then you have a proper tripod set. Alright, for the next one, this will be similar, but we're only going to use 2 poles and build, say, an A-frame. Alright, and this will be what's called a shear lash. Again, we're going to start off with a clove hitch. Now this time, instead of doing the figure 8, we're just going to loop around both poles. Alright, and again, I'm going to capture the loose end of my clove hitch there that I started with. And you don't have to crank these together. Again, we're going to keep it fairly loose for now. We're going to go around it 5 to 7 times. Alright, and then again, this is where we're going to get the tightening of it. We'll do a couple of frappings and we'll tighten everything down. So all the frapping is, again, is going in between our 2 poles there, and that's how we're going to crank down our shear lashing. Alright, and again, just a couple of frappings is all you need, so we'll do a couple, and then we'll open up our poles here a little bit to make it easier, and we'll finish off with a clove hitch again. Cordage isn't being cooperative this morning. Alright, so we got our clove hitch. So that's the shear lashing, and we can set up our A-frame. Alright, and again, this, you could use this if I didn't have a couple of good trees to set my shelter up with, you know, to use as a ridge pole. I could make a couple of A-frames with a ridge pole on it and set up my shelter from there. Alright, just for an example. Alright, so the next one we'll work on is more of a structural kind of lashing. This is what we're going to use to build things around camp. Alright, I guess an easy example would be to lash a ridge pole in between 2 trees, so to speak. Alright, so the first one we'll do is what they call the diagonal lashing, and this will be crisscrossed across the X of what we're lashing together. Alright, we're going to start this one. This is the one lashing that uses a timber hitch. Alright, so we'll get our timber hitch tied here 3 or 4 times around itself, and we'll go crank down. Now when we crank it down, that's also the direction we're going to start tying. Alright, so what we're going to do is go diagonally around the X 2 or 3 times. Keep things fairly lined up, and again, in this case you do want to kind of keep things tightened up, but you don't have to necessarily crank it down yet. Once we get 2 or 3 over, what we're going to do is change directions. We'll come up underneath there and we'll go back across our X from the sticks. Alright, and we'll do that 2 or 3 times. Once we get 2 or 3 good wrappings that direction, on one of your wraps coming up, where you're in between the 2 sticks, we're going to do the frappings again. We're going to crank things down. That's where we're going to get our structure from. So just like the other ones, 2 good wraps is all you need. And then once we get to the end, that's what I like about using the bank line too. You can kind of hold everything down with the finger we'll tie a clove hitch. Alright. So again, going around over the top of itself. Again, we kind of hold things down with one finger when we make our second loop. Then come back through again and tighten her off. Alright. So that's our diagonal lashing. Again, this is our structural. Alright, so for our other structural lashing we're going to talk about is the square lashing. Alright. So what we're going to start off with is a clove hitch. And I usually put that on the bottom one. Doesn't matter, you could have started on the top one, but either way, bring your cordage over the top of the cross piece, go back down and go underneath the other one. Alright, and when you come back up, go over the top again, go back down, go underneath, and that's all you're going to do. It's kind of an over, around, under, around, over. Again, keeping your lines kind of nice and neat, keeping them snug but not necessarily cranked down for now, because we're going to take care of that again in a minute. And you're going to do at least 3 wrappings like that. Alright, over, under, over, under. We got our 3 wrappings. So then, just like we did with the other one, when we come up, we'll come up in between them and we'll do our 2 frappings. Right? And this is where we'll crank it down and get our structure out of it. Crank that down again. We're going to do that at least twice. And finish off with a clove hitch. Okay, and there's our square lashing. Alright. Alright, so those are the basic knots, hitches, and lashings that we're going to use for all our projects that we're going to do. We may introduce some new ones along the way, but those are the basic ones that you're really going to need when you head out in the woods and start working on some of these skills. In our next video, we're actually going to get out, rain or shine, and start working on shelter. Alright, that's our next step. If you remember the rule of threes, that's one of our first things in the rule of threes. Inclement weather, we need to have shelter. So we'll talk about short-term shelters or quickie shelters, like that's why we're carrying a poncho or a tarp or something like that with us. We'll pop one of those up, and we'll also talk a little bit more about natural shelters, and we'll build one of those. All right, for something a little more long-term, semi-permanent. So thanks for joining us, and until next time.